Hi folks, I'm Mike Schienle from Windbridge Woodcrafts. I'm showing a small octagonal box being created in this video that uses a pair of concealed barrel hinges. We're ignoring pretty much every detail about this box except for the barrel hinges. We'll get to numbers for the holes, offsets, and depths in a moment. Let's just see it being done on the CNC first. Since our 1/4 inch end mill is smaller than the 25/64 inch or 10mm hole that we need, we run our end mill in an expanding circle to get the right size. I do this as a roughing pass with a 25% step over, followed by a finishing pass with a 10% step over. The roughing pass should remove all the material we need, but you can hear the finishing pass also removing a little material. That's the nature of my $3,000 hobby level machine compared to an industrial machine starting at 10 times the price. We just finished the barrel hinge holes in the base, and we'll get the ones in the top of the box next. The top is a little shorter than the base, so we removed a little more material from the board, but still left plenty for the barrel hinges to be seated to the correct depth. We're using SOSS, S-O-S-S, 10mm barrel hinges here. SOSS provides the measurements primarily in millimeters. I'll translate to inches where needed and explain any differences I use along the way. I'll also show the SOSS engineering drawings to help out. The hole depth we need is 11.5mm or 0.45 inches. The hole diameter is 10mm or 0.39 inches. The hole offset from the edge of the material is 1.8mm or 0.071 inches. Don't worry about those numbers for the moment. As soon as we finish the CNC work here, I'll show where those numbers came from and the CNC parameters needed to create them. That wraps up the CNC. Now let's talk about the diameter, depth, and offset for the hinges. That's all we're concerned with, but we do need to get them right. I'm using VCarve Pro for my box model, but you don't need anything this involved to use these hinges. Just capture the concept here if you're working with something else and translate it as needed. If this boomer dork can figure it out, so can you. This is the box base on the left and lid on the right, just as you saw the CNC cutting a moment ago. The hinges are highlighted in pink and we'll show their parameters. Before that, there's a variable called zHinge that shows up in a couple dialog boxes. That's the Z depth of the hinge, which I've set to 0.47 inches. Welcome to the first of 3 fudge factors, this one for depth, the next for diameter, and the last for offset. SOSS calls for a 11.5mm depth, or 0.45 inches. I add an extra 0.02 inches to make sure any debris in the hinge or hole has some room to get shoved out of the way if needed. If not needed, just set the hinge top flush with your wood. So, zHinge is 0.47 inches. Here's one of the SOSS diagrams, this one specifically for the 10mm hinge. They have other sizes, but let's just keep this to the 10mm for simplicity. You can see the 11.5mm depth highlighted in green in the middle. The hinge diameter is 10mm, or 0.39 inches, and is highlighted in blue on the right. Which brings us to fudge factor number 2. I set the model for this to 0.408 inches instead of 0.39 inches, since I can't get the hinge installed in anything tighter than that. You'll see in a few minutes when I'm installing the hinges that I can get the majority of the hinge installed by hand, but need a ratchet clamp to finish it off. This is a CNC thing and not a SOSS error, so you may need to run a few test holes with slightly different fudge factors to see what works best for your CNC, your router/spindle, bits, and wood. All of these contribute the tiniest amount of variation just to keep your life entertaining. Back to the SOSS diagram to deal with the last fudge factor, the offset from the edge of the wood of 1.8mm or 0.071 inches, seen in red on the left side of the diagram. Note in this case of the octagonal box with the hinges in the corners of 2 points of the octagon that we're keeping an offset from both corners of each hinge. Just use an offset from one edge if you're doing something simpler on a shape like a rectangle, where the holes are not necessarily in the corners. So, we need to add an offset of 0.071 inches to our hole diameter of 0.39 inches, which we've fudged to 0.408 inches. That 0.071 inch offset is a radius measure, but we have a diameter of 0.408 inches. By doubling 0.071 inches to 0.142 inches, we make it a diameter, and adding it to 0.408 inches, we end up with a diameter of 0.55 inches. Let's add a 0.01 piece of fudge to that to get 0.56 inches, which I'll explain in just a moment. So we have a barrel hinge hole with a diameter of 0.408 inches and an offset hole with a diameter of 0.56 inches that we just need to center on each other to create the offset around the hinge. That extra 0.01 inches gives us some additional material to sand off without getting anywhere close to the hinge itself. It's just a thin belt to add to the suspenders, if you know what I mean. Quick summary of that is a hinge hole of 0.408 inches and an offset circle of 0.56 inches centered on each other. We don't need to make a 0.56 inch hole anywhere. We just use that diameter to place against the edge of the model to get us the offset to our 0.408 inch hole. You can see that in the model here. I hope that explains everything adequately. If not, please drop a comment and I'll do my best to address it. These are the feeds and speeds used for the rough pass for the barrel hinge holes. And these are the feeds and speeds for the finish pass. These are just provided as an example. Your mileage may vary. We're finally installing the hinges. Fiddle with the hinge until you can see which way it opens. When you install the hinge in the hole, the opening angle must be perpendicular to the edge you've used for the offset. In other words, the opening end of the hinge should extend over the edge of your board. If you rotate it a tiny bit off perpendicular, the hinge may bind and your offset may not be adequate, causing the base and top to not open and close correctly. You can do this by eye. Just take your time and align it as closely as you can. If you get it misaligned, you can extract the hinge and try again. They're pretty sturdy, but if it's a tight fit to put it in, it will take some effort and imagination to coax it back out. Put some kind of padding, such as paper towels or shop rags, on your tools to prevent marking the wood or hinges. This hinge is a pretty tight fit, so I'm going to do what I can by hand and then finish up with a clamp to completely bury the hinge in the hole. I prefer to be able to do it without needing a clamp, but this isn't a problem. Maybe a little more fudge was needed earlier. Depending on how tight the hinge is in the wood, you can likely test the open and close action without tightening the set screws. If not, just tighten the set screws enough so you can test it out. The screws typically need a couple complete revolutions to be set. They rarely need adjusting afterward. We have a few around our house that get regularly used and have held up great. I'll be quiet a moment until we get to the set screws. Here's something to point out about these hinges, set screws, and grain direction. It's possible to split the wood when tightening where the force of the hinge set screw is applying pressure along the grain, but it's pretty rare. The one I'm working on is with the grain. You can see I'm using a tiny screwdriver, so there's not a lot of leverage I can apply. An obvious recommendation is to avoid any kind of powered driver, or adjust your project so your hinge set screw is applying pressure across the grain. A couple turns of the set screws until you meet some resistance lets you know you've done enough. I'll muddle my way through the other pair of set screws, then I'll be quiet before a final comment and sign off. Thanks for making it through this with me. Lots of numbers were thrown around, which I know is tedious. Hopefully I kept it concise enough to follow. If you have questions about what I provided or some of the other sizes and offsets that go along with them, please let me know in the comments. Here's the box with the barrel hinges installed along with magnets that keep the lid shut. These are part of a set for my wife's ministry business. Thanks for watching.